The first global news operation was CNN. CNN began in 1980, founded by Ted Turner. It was a visionary enterprise. Many thought it would fail. There was no way it would seem to be a challenge to the American domestic networks. But it did succeed. And 5 years later, CNN International was created as a companion network. You've probably never seen CNN International because generally it's not seen in the U.S. But there's a major focus on international news, as you would expect, on CNN International. More straight news, less talk, and 90% of the programming from CNN International is different than the domestic. There's some overlap. They're major interview shows, perhaps the Wolf Blitzer shows, whatever their dominant primetime program, that usually is in common. And then in breaking news, they also go into one network if it's a worldwide story. You're going to visit CNN in London, and you'll meet some journalists you probably never heard of before, like Richard Quest here, who's very prominent around the world to viewers of CNN International, but maybe not known in the U.S. CNN London is a major hub for the network, and they anchor the news many hours a day, usually in the afternoon London time, which would be in the morning American time. We're also going to CNN Paris, which basically consists of this one gentleman, Jim Bitterman, the most senior foreign correspondent in the world today. In 2015, he celebrated 50 years in journalism. He's received the Legion of Honor by the French government, its highest honor, and has an incredible amount of international experience. Now, if you had been to Paris 40 or 50 years ago, there would have been more foreign correspondents than any other place on earth. It was really the hub of international journalism, especially following World War II. But now with Asia taking prominence and the Middle East and many areas of the world becoming major hotspots, Paris is in the backwater. And there is now only one network correspondent in Paris, and it's Jim Bitterman. So when you see a story, a big breaking story, and there have been many in France in recent years, the only person who's resident there, who speaks French, who's there every single day, is Jim Bitterman. The rest fly in from London or America. And it really makes a difference in the quality of coverage. The BBC launched its own global news organization to compete with CNN and has done very well. World News is now a part of the global news gathering machinery of the BBC. One thing to keep in mind is that the BBC World News is part of its commercial arm. It's not part of the license fee. This is done to make money, and that's what separates it from other parts of the BBC News world. BBC World News, following on the success of the BBC World Service, definitely has a global following. They're located in the brand new headquarters of the BBC, just off historic Broadcasting House. And here's a video that tells you a little bit about that space.
Welcome to the world's newsroom.
A pretty impressive place for an impressive news organization. Another major global news player is Al Jazeera, which is funded by the Emir of Qatar in the Persian Gulf. Qatar was a pretty obscure place until Al Jazeera came along, and now it's become a big megalopolis in that part of the world as well. The name Al Jazeera doesn't resonate well with many Americans today. It started off on the wrong foot at the beginning of the Gulf War, and didn't help itself when it aired tapes by Osama bin Laden that no one else would air. Al Jazeera was seen as partisan, biased towards Middle Eastern nations, and really had a hard time getting traction in the U.S. In fact, no cable operation in this country would carry Al Jazeera, especially in this part of the nation. It was many, many years and a whole different structure before Al Jazeera would be seen in any measure in the United States. Al Jazeera began as an Arabic language network, so another problem with it was most Americans had no access to it either through the television or through language. But that changed in 2010 when Al Jazeera launched its own English language network, the third global competitor. So you had CNN International, BBC World, and Al Jazeera. And many of the people who went to work for this English language network began their careers at the BBC or one of the American networks or the CBC in Canada. So on the air, Al Jazeera English looks a lot like its competitors. It started with hubs in 4 countries, in Doha, the capital of Qatar, London, Washington, D.C., and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And more now you see it coming out of London and Doha, but still satellites in Washington and Kuala Lumpur. Al Jazeera English is an entirely separate building. When you go to Doha, they're across the street from each other, but under separate management and don't have that much in common. But Al Jazeera English has gradually gained credibility, especially with the beginning of Arab Spring. That Al Jazeera had showed itself to be a very courageous news organization that had people on the ground reporting factually and willing to stand up for objective news coverage.
This is Al Jazeera. It's November the 15th, day 1 of a new era in television news.
Pretty much a disaster.
It has, but you see, what I say to people is, why is it difficult in Iraq?
This was entirely peaceful protest, but they've just come along and sprayed chemicals into the faces of hundreds and hundreds of protesters.
For 3 days, Al Jazeera have been with Taliban fighters. We've seen no Afghan army, no Afghan police, and no British soldiers.
I was interviewing the leader, and then suddenly he declared that I was formally being taken hostage.
Amid the flattened villages on the outer islands of the Irrawaddy Delta, a desperate race is underway. They say this is the last bowl of rice in the entire village, and the ponds they use for drinking water are all contaminated.
When the quake hit, it lasted an unbearable 2 minutes, destroying everything.
Half the population is dead.
I hear that some male students clashed with police and took their guns. As a result of that action, a gun battle has begun.
I'm okay, Ghazi. How are you? What's happening inside?
Over 100 journalists and cameramans have been killed.
Either you have to stop your work as a journalist or you have to get out.
The divisive nature of this campaign has brought out into the open what's usually discussed behind closed doors in America.
change has come to America.
We can now project that Democratic candidate Barack Obama is the next president of the United States.
This is exactly what many here had been fearing.
Retaliation, revenge.
Potter, go.
We heard constant shelling throughout the day.
Camel Tigers are still well armed, desperate and dangerous.
We've definitely found a black jail here.
They're throwing straight at me. Sorry, we're under attack. Listen, trying to take us off the air.
The situation here is getting increasingly worse. People are so hungry.
Many Greeks have deep economic concerns, but there are also groups who have a deep antipathy towards the Greek police.
The anti-government momentum is building up. The demands of these protesters are the same.
I never thought that we'd ever witness such a day.
This is Al Jazeera. President Hosni Mubarak has resigned.
It is truly a historic moment.
We are being told that this tsunami is very real. It is coming our way. We are on the last truck to leave.
It's chaos. The hospital is full of casualties.
Moments ago, 2 missiles have landed about 100 meters away from us. We're on the front line, but it's under attack.
Gaddafi forces, we have to go. Quickly. There's a party in the Libyan capital tonight, and the people of Libya are now in charge of their capital.
Literally changing people's minds and attitudes. And like it or hate it, it is really effective. And in fact, viewership of Al Jazeera is going up in the United States because it's real news.
Al Jazeera English bought an existing cable channel in the U.S. in 2012, and that gave them more coverage in more places. So Al Jazeera English is not a ghost anymore in this country. You can get it on DirecTV and certain cable channels, especially in big cities. And with more exposure has come greater credibility for Al Jazeera. As you saw in the video, it's a very courageous news organization. It's there on the front lines. It doesn't shy away from blood and guts. It doesn't shy away from controversy. In fact, Al Jazeera has been kicked out of just about every country in the Middle East. Several of its journalists were held for several years in Egypt, and they're not the friendliest to governments, but it's caused them a big jump in credibility. They won a lot of awards, and they are a very serious news organization. And here are just some shots of some of the things they cover. They're very big presence in Africa, large correspondent corps. They're out there in the field. They were huge in the Arab Spring, and they continue in all the coverage, all the big coverage areas of the world. Another global news organization you've never heard of is called Bloomberg News, founded by former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who has actually rejoined the organization. Bloomberg was a bond trader in the United States, a very successful bond trader who was fired from his job. And with his severance came a big wad of cash that he invested in some terminals that would supply up-to-the-minute information to other bond traders. It was a competitor to Reuters, and Bloomberg was so good at it that these terminals became the gold standard for traders around the world. Once that had become successful, Bloomberg ventured into news as a loss leader. Now, there's a picture of the terminal, pretty prosaic stuff to us lay people, but to someone involved in money, you can get almost any information you can possibly imagine through the Bloomberg terminal. Here's our headquarters in New York. They spare no expense anywhere they go to be a leader and get the best journalists, the best facilities. And they're building a new headquarters in London, and they are really top of the line in just about every area. And they don't have to worry about making a profit because the profit is coming from the terminals, and Bloomberg's able to subsidize the news organization. Their audience is elite, affluent consumers. It's not the average guy generally, although you can get Bloomberg News on most cable stations, and you can get it free on your phone as well. It's a really good source of information that goes beyond just the financial markets and is a credible competitor with some of the other news organizations we've discussed.